It is August 6, 2026, and buried in the middle of a story everyone is calling a ceasefire is a detail almost nobody is putting front and center. 3 weeks ago, the United States military did something to a tiny island at the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz that the Pentagon's own analysts had spent years calling unsinkable. Not undefended, not weak, unsinkable. That was the actual word used by American military planners to describe this stretch of rock, because you cannot bomb an island into the ocean the way you can level a building. It just sits there, permanently, guarding the choke point whether you hit it or not. And on July 15th, that is exactly the island the United States chose to hit with 5,000-pound bunker buster bombs in broad daylight for 90 straight minutes. The island is called Greater Tunb. If you have never heard of it before this year, you are not alone. It is small, it is mostly barren, and for most of its history it has been a footnote in a dispute between two countries that never went to war over it. But right now, in the middle of the most dangerous naval standoff since the Iran-Iraq tanker war of the 1980s, Greater Tunb sits exactly where the United States Navy needs to sail, and exactly where Iran built one of its most heavily fortified missile positions in the entire Persian Gulf. And that collision is why, on July 15th, American bombers went after a network of underground bunkers that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy spent years building into the rock itself. This is John. If you want the version of this war that separates what is confirmed from what is just noise on Telegram, subscribe, because we are about to walk through exactly what got hit, why the Pentagon picked this island specifically, and what it tells you about how close this war actually is to spreading further, even while diplomats in Doha are shaking hands over a piece of paper. Let's start with the geography, because the geography is the entire reason this island matters more than its size would ever suggest. The Strait of Hormuz is the narrowest ocean choke point on Earth that actually matters to the global economy. At its tightest point, the shipping lanes are barely 2 miles wide in each direction, one lane in, one lane out, separated by a buffer zone. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil and a huge share of its liquefied natural gas passes through that gap every single day in peacetime. And because the water on much of the Persian Gulf side is shallow, large tankers and warships cannot simply route around the danger. They are funneled, by the physics of the seafloor, into narrow channels that pass close to a small cluster of islands. Researchers who study this region call that cluster of islands Iran's arc defense. 7 islands in total: Abu Musa, Greater Tunb, Lesser Tunb, Hengam, Keshem, Larak, and Hormuz itself. A 2022 study by Iranian and Chinese researchers singled out 3 of them as the most critical for controlling the strait: Abu Musa, Greater Tunb, and Lesser Tunb. Because ships are forced by geography to pass so close to these 3, whoever holds them effectively holds a firing position on every vessel that transits the strait, military or civilian, American or Iranian. That is not a metaphor. It is a targeting solution. Iran has known this for over 50 years. Greater Tunb has been under Iranian control since November 30th, 1971, seized just 2 days before the United Arab Emirates formally became independent. The UAE, through the Emirate of Ras Al Khaimah, has claimed the island ever since, and the sovereignty dispute has simmered, unresolved, for more than half a century. It has mattered diplomatically. It has occasionally mattered in oil and gas negotiations. It has never, until this year, mattered as a live military target. Now here's what changed. Beginning last year, the IRGC Navy announced publicly that it was reinforcing its presence on Abu Musa, Greater Tunb, and Lesser Tunb. Iran's naval commander at the time, Rear Admiral Alireza Tangsiri, said the tactical approach required Iran to, in his words, arm and operationalize this group of islands, adding that Iran had the capability to strike enemy bases, warships, and assets in the region from these exact positions. Tangsiri is no longer in a position to expand on that statement. He was killed in an Israeli operation earlier in this war, a detail Israel and U.S. Central Command confirmed without much elaboration. So, Iran told the world, in plain language, that it was turning these islands into forward missile platforms. And Western military planners took that seriously enough to draw up a name for the problem: unsinkable positions that cannot be neutralized by economic pressure or blockade alone, only by physically destroying what is built on top of them or underneath them. That brings us to July 15th. According to U.S. Central Command, American forces launched a wave of precision strikes against Greater Tunb Island beginning at 6 a.m. Eastern Time, targeting coastal defense systems along with what CENTCOM described as cruise missile storage and launch sites. The attack lasted approximately 90 minutes. It marked the 5th consecutive day the United States had struck targets inside Iranian-controlled territory during that phase of the war, and it was notable for something CENTCOM doesn't advertise often. This was a daylight operation, a shift from the nighttime strikes that had characterized earlier phases of the campaign. Analysts reading the tea leaves on that shift noted it signaled something specific: Striking in daylight means you are confident the other side's air defenses in that sector have already been suppressed enough that you don't need darkness to protect your aircraft. In plain terms, the US was telling Iran, we don't need the cover anymore. What CENTCOM actually found on Greater Tunbi, once you get past the press release language, is the more interesting part. The island hosts what has been described as a vast network of underground bunkers, constructed by the IRGC Navy specifically for cruise missile storage and launch operations. This wasn't a scattering of missile trucks parked on open ground. This was tunnel infrastructure, hardened, built into the terrain, the kind of target that requires specific munitions to actually destroy rather than just scorch the surface, which is exactly why the United States used 5,000-pound bunker buster bombs, weapons specifically selected because lighter ordnance would have left the tunnel systems intact underneath a cratered surface. You can bomb the roof of a bunker complex all day with smaller munitions and still leave the missiles sitting safely inside. It takes something built to punch through rock and concrete before it detonates to actually collapse the tunnel itself. The specific weapons Iran was storing in there matter too. Reporting identifies the systems housed in the Greater Tunbi bunkers as Noor and Qadr anti-ship cruise missiles, both purpose-built to threaten large surface vessels, the kind of missiles you fire at a tanker or a warship transiting a choke point from a fixed, camouflaged position on shore. These are not symbolic weapons. They are precisely the hardware that turns a strait that is barely 2 miles wide into a shooting gallery if the side controlling the coastline decides to use it. But here's the detail that keeps this story from being a simple, clean victory. And it's the detail a lot of triumphant coverage skipped over. Destroying the bunkers on Greater Tunb does not eliminate Iran's ability to threaten shipping through the strait. IRGC engineers built this missile network with deliberate redundancy, distributing Noor and Qadr batteries across multiple firing positions along Iran's Persian Gulf coastline, not concentrating them in a single vulnerable node. Taking out one island's storage and launch infrastructure is a real blow. It is not the whole network. Think of it less like cutting off the head of a snake and more like breaking one finger on a hand that still has 9 more. Iran's public response on the day of the strike reinforced exactly that posture. Iran's foreign minister, Nasser Baghai, said plainly that there were no plans for negotiations, that the focus was on defending the country, not a threat laced with theatrics, just a flat refusal to treat the strike as an opening for talks. On the same day, the IRGC claimed it had struck U.S. military sites in the Gulf in retaliation, and Tasnim News Agency, which is affiliated with the Guard, reported that Iranian air defenses had activated across eastern and western zones of Tehran to counter what it called enemy reconnaissance aircraft. Separately, at least 7 Iranian personnel were reported killed in U.S. strikes on a military base at Bampur that same night, a target far from the coastline entirely, underscoring how wide this campaign's target list had become by the middle of July. And Iran's retaliation wasn't limited to symbolic statements. The Revolutionary Guard launched missile and drone strikes against U.S. military facilities in Bahrain, Jordan, and Kuwait in direct response to the Greater Tunb operation and the broader wave of strikes around it. This is the part that should genuinely concern anyone tracking regional stability, because Bahrain, Jordan, and Kuwait are not combatants in this war by choice. They are hosts to American military infrastructure, and every time Iran responds to a U.S. strike by hitting facilities inside their borders, it drags 3 additional governments deeper into a conflict they did not start and cannot easily exit. The United Nations Shipping Agency went as far as warning that the Strait of Hormuz had become too dangerous for commercial vessels during this period, and at least 2 ships were confirmed turned around under a reimposed naval blockade that the U.S. had put back in place at the direction of President Trump. Within 17 hours of that blockade being reinstated, American forces said they had, in their words, redirected 2 commercial vessels attempting to breach it. Zoom out from Greater Tunb specifically, and you start to see the pattern the island fits inside. Over the 48 hours surrounding that mid-July strike wave, American operations Bolsheviks reportedly hit more than 300 locations across Iran, ranging from major mainland port cities like Bandar Abbas and Bushehr to a whole cluster of islands including Keshem, Kish, and Abu Musa alongside Greater Tunb itself. This wasn't an isolated island raid. It was one strike inside a coordinated campaign against the entire arc of Iranian positions ringing the strait, executed within the same 48-hour window. The kind of tempo that suggests a deliberate attempt to dismantle Iran's choke point leverage all at once, rather than picking it apart island by island over months. Now here's where the story gets genuinely strange. Because the same week Greater Tunb was getting hit with bunker busters, Iran's own leadership was fortifying a completely different island for exactly this kind of scenario. Reporting throughout the preceding weeks described Iran laying traps and moving additional military personnel and air defenses onto Karg Island, the country's main oil export terminal, which handles roughly 90% of Iran's crude exports, in anticipation of a possible American ground operation to seize it. Karg had already been struck once, back in March, in a raid Trump described afterward as one of the most powerful bombing operations in the region's history, an attack that reportedly hit more than 90 separate military sites while deliberately sparing the oil infrastructure itself. Trump later suggested in an interview that Iran's defenses on Karg were essentially non-existent, saying the U.S. could take the island very easily. Whatever the accuracy of that assessment, Iran's subsequent buildup on the island suggests Tehran, at minimum, was taking the threat of a ground seizure seriously enough to spend resources preparing for it. Which raises the actual strategic question sitting underneath all of this. The United States has now demonstrated twice that it is willing to strike Iranian-held islands directly, first Karg in March, then Greater Tunb in July. Military analysts describing U.S. options for a potential ground operation have noted that any raid on these islands would likely use tilt-rotor aircraft, the Marine Corps variant of the V-22 Osprey, inserting elements from the 82nd Airborne Division and select Special Forces detachments at low altitude, rather than a conventional beach landing. None of that has happened yet, as far as anything public confirms. But the fact that serious military analysts are mapping out exactly how such an operation would be executed tells you the option is live on someone's planning table, not theoretical. And this is where the phrase unsinkable actually earns its weight rather than just sounding dramatic. CNN's own defense reporting laid out the underlying military logic bluntly. Because the islands themselves cannot be sunk or eliminated the way a ship or an airfield can be, Iranian military positions built on top of them would have to be physically destroyed, one bunker complex at a time, to guarantee safe passage for American warships, including any carrying Marine expeditionary units, into the heart of the Persian Gulf. You cannot blockade rock. You cannot sanction a bunker network out of existence. The only way to remove the threat these islands pose is exactly what happened on July 15th. Bombs in daylight against hardened tunnels. So where does that leave things as of today, August 6th? The honest answer is suspended between two realities that don't fully agree with each other. On one hand, the diplomatic track has produced more concrete movement in the last several days than it has in months. Reporting out of Doha describes the terms of a prospective Strait of Hormuz arrangement becoming public for the first time just this week. A 60-day interim mechanism that would route inbound traffic through a northern lane in Iranian waters and outbound traffic through a southern lane in Omani waters, with no tolls charged during the temporary period and a commitment to clear naval mines from the median lane within 30 days. President Trump, just days earlier on August 1st, said the U.S. military was, in his words, locked and loaded and ready to hit Iran at levels of military terror, strength, and power not seen since World War II, before announcing he had agreed to cancel the attack to allow for a rapid deal, a nearly identical sequence to one that played out back in June, when he announced strikes on Karg Island and additional oil infrastructure points, then called them off, hours later citing final points of an agreement. On the other hand, the war has visibly worn down the side that is supposedly winning it. According to CNN, citing multiple sources familiar with the matter, the U.S. military has exhausted nearly 80% of its THAAD interceptor inventory and roughly half its Patriot interceptor stockpile. Since the war's opening days in late February, a depletion rate senior commanders are reportedly describing internally as dangerously low. The Center for Strategic and International Studies estimated the U.S. held around 2,200 of its most modernized Patriot interceptors and 452 THAAD missiles before this conflict began. Burning through the majority of that inventory in roughly 5 months is not a detail either side wants broadcast, because it changes the calculus on both ends. It tells Iran that the shield protecting American assets and allied territory in the region has a bottom, and reporting suggests American commanders are now weighing that exhaustion seriously against any further escalation, including any move toward a ground operation on the remaining islands. There's also the matter of leadership on the Iranian side, which has been genuinely strange to watch unfold. Iran's supreme leader has made no public appearance since a confrontation tied to the Hormuz standoff weeks earlier, and Iranian President Pezeshkian stated on August 3rd that he would not resign, a statement that itself only makes sense as an answer to speculation serious enough that it needed answering. None of that is confirmation of anything specific about the chain of command inside Tehran. But layered against a war where the U.S. has struck the country's islands, its capital, its naval bases, and its energy infrastructure, and where Iran's own foreign minister is on record saying there are no plans for negotiations, even as his government's representatives sit in Doha discussing exactly that, The picture is one of an Iranian state managing enormous internal and external pressure simultaneously, not a state that has quietly capitulated. So here's the honest way to hold all of this at once, without collapsing it into either a clean American victory or a clean Iranian defiance. Greater Tumb Island was a real, verified, significant strike against a purpose-built missile bunker network that Iran's own naval commander had publicly bragged about only months before he was killed. It used weapons specifically chosen to destroy hardened underground infrastructure in daylight, signaling operational confidence. It degraded, in CENTCOM's own words, Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping through one of the most economically important waterways on the planet. All of that is confirmed, sourced, and consistent across multiple independent outlets covering the strike as it happened. What is not confirmed is that this ends anything. The missile network Greater Tunbih was part of was built with redundancy in mind precisely so that losing one node would not collapse the whole system. Iran's retaliatory strikes on Bahrain, Jordan, and Kuwait in the days that followed prove the network, or what remains of it, still functions well enough to reach American partners across the Gulf, and the same American military that just demonstrated it can crack open an unsinkable island's underground bunkers is, by its own commander's internal assessment, running low on the interceptors that would protect it from exactly the kind of missile response Iran is still capable of launching. The question that actually matters isn't whether the United States can keep hitting islands like Greater Tunb. It clearly can, and clearly has the targeting intelligence to do it precisely. The question is whether a war that is depleting American missile defense stockpiles at this rate, while producing a diplomatic framework that both sides keep almost signing and then almost abandoning within the same 48 hours, is actually converging toward the ceasefire the headlines keep promising, or just finding new islands to prove it hasn't ended yet. Nobody outside a small circle in Washington, and an even smaller circle in Tehran, knows which of those two futures this week's headlines are actually building toward. But the bunkers on Greater Tunb are gone, the missile network they belong to is not, and the interim Hormuz arrangement being drafted in Doha right now is being negotiated by two sides who, as of this week, are still finding new pieces of unsinkable rock to fight over. That is where this stands on August 6th, 2026. Not resolved, not collapsed, suspended, right in the middle, waiting to see which side runs out of leverage first.